This video is brought to you by Henson Shaving. To Western observers, China can seem both incredibly rich and stupendously poor. Chinese companies like BYD and Huawei are at the technological frontier. The Chinese state has spent trillions on the Belt and Road Initiative and other eye-catching infrastructure projects, and corners of social media are flooded by videos of futuristic-looking Chinese metropoles, with millions of STEM graduates working in hyper-automated factories. And yet, China's GDP per capita is just $13,500, putting it on a par with Montenegro and Turkmenistan, and is apparently mired in a never-ending economic crisis. So, in this video, we thought we'd try to square the circle and explain how China is both rich and poor. We're getting ever closer to 1 million subscribers, and 68% of you haven't even subscribed yet. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's get straight into it. Some of the contradictions in Western perceptions of China and its economy are simply a consequence of the fact that China is just, well, massive. It's easy to forget quite how enormous China is. We talk about it as if it's just another country, like, say, Germany or the UK. But obviously China has a population of 1.4 billion people, roughly the same as Europe, the US, and the whole of continental South America combined. Most of its provinces are, in population terms, larger than the average European country. For instance, China's most populous province, Guangdong, has over 125 million people and would be the 11th most populous country in the world on its own, with a population roughly double that of France or the UK. This both explains why the Chinese state is such a behemoth and why China feels simultaneously rich and poor. After all, within any country of this size, there are always going to be massive differences in wealth. On top of that, China is a pretty unequal country. We did a whole video on this last year, so go and watch that if you want to know more. But the TLDR is that China has a relatively high level of income inequality, with an especially acute urban-rural divide. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this is to look at the Gini coefficient, which is the most popular measure of income inequality. The math behind the Gini coefficient is a little complicated, so we're not going to explain it in full, but the basic idea can be illustrated using graphs. Take a perfectly equal population of 3 people, where everyone earns the same amount. Let's say £1. If you plot a graph that cumulatively measures the share of income against the fraction of the population, it'll just be a straight line at 45 degrees. The first person has £1, 2 people together have £2, 3 people together have £3. Now, imagine this population is a bit less equal. There's still a total of £3 going around, but the first person has 0, the second person has £1, and the third person has £2. This graph is no longer a straight line. Instead, it sort of curves upwards. The first person has £0, 2 together have £1, and all 3 have £3. The Gini coefficient essentially measures the area between those two lines. When it's perfectly equal, there's no space between the two lines, so it's 0. And when the last person has all the money, the area between the two lines is just the entire area underneath the first line, so it's 1. Interestingly, China's Gini coefficient is far higher than that of Western economies. Official data from China's National Bureau of Statistics suggests that China has a Gini coefficient of about 0.46, which, according to World Bank data, would make it the most unequal large economy in the world apart from South Africa, which is by far and away the most unequal country in the world, and Brazil. This is in large part because of China's urban-rural divide. 2023 data from China's National Bureau of Statistics suggests that urban households have more than twice the disposable income of their rural counterparts. And in 2020, China's Prime Minister made quite a stir inside China when he admitted that 600 million rural Chinese were still living on less than 1,000 yuan a month. For context, that's about $140 a month, or about $1,700 a year. You get the idea. China feels both rich and poor because, well, it is. It's an enormous and relatively unequal country. But this apparent duality is also the consequence of the underlying structure of the Chinese economy. In short, the Chinese government has implemented a number of policies that effectively squeeze Chinese households and mean that Chinese workers are underpaid. Most obviously, the CCP deliberately undervalues the yuan, which makes Chinese exports more competitive internationally, but means that Chinese workers and households can't afford as many imports. Labour unions are also illegal in China, and China's tax system focuses on consumption taxes like VAT rather than income, which makes it surprisingly regressive. These taxes are often then used to subsidise state-owned enterprises instead of being spent on public services, which effectively means more exports for state-owned enterprises at workers' expense. This is all exacerbated by China's particularly cutthroat form of state-directed capitalism, which is one of the big reasons that China has so many internationally competitive companies. This is somewhat of a simplification, but the way this system works is that the CCP will signal that they want to dominate some new industry, like solar panels or electric vehicles, and provincial governments will respond by racing to support nascent companies in that sector. This creates tens, if not hundreds, of competing companies, all under pressure from their provincial governments, which, without real worker protections, creates a ruthless race to the bottom. There's even a word for this in Chinese political discourse, neiyuan, which roughly translates to the English word involution, a concept from sociology that refers to a society that can no longer evolve, where competition is ruthless but fundamentally unsustainable or redundant. The word became popular on Chinese social media a couple of years ago to describe the predicament of overqualified and overworked graduates, but was mentioned in official documents for the first time last year. Anyway, this system creates a fundamental imbalance in the Chinese economy. Even though Chinese companies are efficient and productive, Chinese workers and households don't earn or spend enough. This means there's more production than demand in the Chinese economy. And this is the root cause of China's persistent trade surpluses. After all, if Chinese workers and households don't have enough spending power, Chinese businesses have to sell their subsequent surplus abroad. This in turn explains why China looks both rich and poor. The international dominance of Chinese exporters make China look rich, but this international dominance was in part achieved by squeezing Chinese incomes, which is why China also looks poor. Chinese households aren't helped by capital controls and the CCP's control over the banking system. For context, unlike in most other countries, the Chinese banking system is dominated by a handful of state-owned behemoths, and the CCP limits how much money households and businesses can send out of the country. Not only does it make this harder for Chinese households to earn a return on their savings, it's also one of the big reasons that the CCP can afford all of their eye-catching mega projects. Via a whole load of complicated mechanisms, including a network of so-called sovereign wealth funds, the CCP essentially leverages Chinese savings in the banking system to finance their investments abroad. Again, this partly explains why the Chinese state sometimes looks so omnipotent. Capital controls and state control of the banking system gives the state more financial power at the expense of Chinese businesses and households. Ultimately, the apparent duality of the Chinese economy both reflects China's size, but also the underlying structure of the Chinese economy, which essentially squeezes workers and households to the benefit of exporters and the state. Lots of people actively don't like shaving. It's getting increasingly expensive, with brands selling overpriced razor cartridges stuffed with useless technology. And even if you do pay for all of it, you're often still left with a bad shave, razor burn, ingrown hairs, and irritation. That's a problem that Henson aimed to solve with their razor. So, in typical TLDR style, let me explain why Henson's razors are better for 3 reasons. Firstly, Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, holds blades at a perfect 30-degree angle, extending the blade just 0.0013 inches past the shave plane. That's less than the thickness of a human hair, which keeps the blade supported properly, unlike many other companies' blades, and ensures a better protection for your skin. Secondly, they're just cheaper. Those fancy blade cartridges are full of single-use junk, which makes each individual blade way more expensive than what you actually need. Henson's razor just takes totally standard blades that cost just a few cents, which means you can save money and can refresh your blades more often, so you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face to try and get value out of that overpriced plastic. Finally, speaking of plastic, those cartridges aren't good for the environment either, with 2 billion razor cartridges thrown away every year in the US alone. That's not true of Henson's blades, which contain 0 plastic, even in their packaging. If you want to try it out, go to hensonshaving.com/TLDR or click the link in the description. Then add a razor and 100 blades to your cart. Once you've done that, add our discount code TLDR at checkout and you'll get all of those blades totally free.